Welcome to Mental Makeover Radio, your go-to destination for meaningful conversations about mental health. I'm your host and your trusted therapist bestie, Cecilia Manella. Join us as we explore the complexities and messiness of human experience by addressing your questions and concerns. I'm here to provide a straightforward and practical therapy advice. So grab your favorite beverage, whether it's tea, coffee, or whatever tickles your taste buds, and get ready to embark on a mental makeover. Hello and welcome to Mental Makeover Radio. I'm your host, Cecilia Manella, and I am super excited that you're here joining us today for today's conversation. So we're diving into a bit of a heavier topic today, but I'm hoping that it will resonate with so many people because we are all either dealing with or have dealt with or going to be dealing with grief. And we're diving in today with Al's question, and he writes to the podcast and says, how to deal with the upcoming death of a parent. You know, I just wanted to say thank you, Al, for your question. And I know how hard navigating grief can be. And I'm so grateful that you submitted this question to the podcast so we can begin diving into this conversation about grief. I think we avoid it just a little bit too much. And I think that it's important that we, have these kind of conversations and maybe change the type of conversations that we're having about grief. This topic is, really close to my heart because I've experienced the sudden death in my own life when my husband died suddenly in 2016. And I've learned a lot about grief through my own journey, as well as walking, grief journey with so many other people. And I feel very grateful and thankful to have walked that path with other people. And I've learned a lot, and I want to share that with you today. And as a culture, we don't really talk enough about grief. I mean, probably because we don't really talk a lot about death. So we almost pretend that we're going to live forever and that we're surprised when somebody that we care about or someone that's really meaningful to us dies. Maybe it's because we're so focused on staying young. Maybe we're so focused on living forever. You can see this reflected in advertising that we're all drowning in. Or maybe it's because we are a culture that really avoids vulnerability and discomfort. And we hope that it's just never going to happen to us, which is so weird if you really think about it, that we think that death isn't going to happen to us. Because, we're all going to die. And I know it's not a very fun topic and it's not a very exciting topic. But the truth is, none of us are going to get out of here alive. We, have, human history is thousands and thousands of years, and we've all died along the way. And we are all going to confront death in one way or the other. And, if we live long enough, if we have the privilege of living long enough, the people in our lives are going to die before we die. And I really wonder what it would be like if we navigated grief just a little bit differently. And I wonder what it would be like if we actually talked a bit more openly about death and grief, if we would navigate things just a little bit different. Living in a culture that avoids talking about death, we try to box up grief. We try to somehow control it, or we like to package it up all pretty and put it on a shelf somewhere so it doesn't impact us in some way. Or that we can put it away to a more convenient time that really works for us. And that convenient time never comes. It's like we think we can manage it in many ways. And maybe that's because we live in a culture where we're inundated with messaging that we can manage things, and we need to be, focused on time management and efficiency and productivity and all the things that come along. And we never really talk about, allowing space just for the messy human experience that we have. And this is what I've learned about grief, is grief is a persistent bastard. It will wait you out. It is patient. It doesn't care about your need for control. It doesn't care what's on your schedule. It will take up space whether you like it or not, and it will only let you avoid it for so long. And then it will take over because it demands a lot of attention. You cannot skip through it. We cannot try to control it. It's just really not worth it, even trying. I truly believe that our need to avoid grief and control it is when it leads to more complex mental health issues. So it's when we try to stop it or hide it or avoid it, that it trickles into other things like depression and anxiety and potentially PTSD and sleeplessness and insomnia and OCD and all these other things that show up are sometimes really connected to avoided grief. So it's best to just give it space and ride the waves of it. As shitty as it might be, it's best to ride the waves. Know that it has intensity. It goes up and it comes down, just like the waves of the ocean. Some moments you're going to feel like you're drowning, and other moments you're going to feel a relief of laughter. And that's just how it's meant to be. It's not meant to be controlled. So I don't have a lot of, 5 tips or 5 ways or those things. I just have some suggestions for Al, if you're listening, and also for anybody else who may be living in grief or preparing for grief, preparing for the death of somebody, or just some things to consider, and things to consider about moving away from the shoulds. We have so many expectations with grief, whether it's anticipatory grief, so a death that we know that is coming, or the sudden grief that shows up with a sudden death. Even with all my professional knowledge and training and experience and education, when I was in the midst of my own grief journey, I also held on to some of those shoulds, how I should be feeling, how I should be behaving, how it should go, how it shouldn't have been happened this way, or, the timelines. I should be feeling better by now. I should be doing this. All the shoulds are shoulding all over ourselves. And list goes on and on and on. And every one of us has our own should list. And I want you to shed that just a little bit. I want you to ask yourself how many shoulds you're carrying, and I want you to get rid of them. Because there are no shoulds. It is what it is. If you're feeling sad, that's what it needs to be. If you're laughing in a moment, that's just the way it needs to be. If you're feeling all over the place and can't really figure out what you're feeling or what you're thinking, then that's also the way it should be. If you want to sleep all the time, that's okay too. If you are battling with thought processes or cognitions or intrusive thoughts or things that are popping up in your head, then that's just the way it needs to be too. There isn't one singular way of grieving. In fact, I would say we all have our own grieving process, and that's just the way it needs to be. We may have some connecting points with other people, and our journeys can be somewhat similar. There may be aspects that are similar, but our journey in grief is actually really unique to us. And that's mainly because, one, we're really unique human beings. Even though we're fairly similar, we're still very different. But our relationship to the person that is dying or has died is actually very different. So even if in a family, you have one person who is dying, like Al's parent who is dying, everyone's relationship to that person is really different. So if the relationships are different, then the grieving will actually be different. So everyone connected to this one person will have a very different experience. There may be some connecting points or overlapping points, but know that your process is unique to you, and that's the way it needs to be. The idea that we all go through this process in a very similar way is kind of ridiculous. And it just leads to our internal judgments or external judgments that can be really harmful to us. So embrace the fact that your process is yours. You don't need to justify it to anybody. It is what it is. And what you need today is going to be really different than what you need tomorrow, and what you need next week, and what you need for months from now or years from now. And you just need to work on getting rid of the shoulds and accepting what is. I often hear people citing the 5 stages of grief. That was a book written by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and her 1969, she wrote a 1969 book called The Death and Dying. And the funny thing is, we use it today to cite stages of grief, but the truth is that she interviewed people at the end of life stages, so people who were dying in palliative care. And she wrote this book to help doctors understand the stages of dying for other doctors, because at the time in the 1960s, 1950s, when she was a doctor, psychologist, and psychiatrist, there wasn't a lot of information or training on dying. And so she wrote this book through interviews. She interviewed people who were dying. And she came to 5 stages of people that were dying, the whole anger and, negotiation and coming to a place of acceptance. It was really meant for the literature on the process of dying. So somewhere along the way, I'm not really sure when, how, or what happened, we adapted these stages to the living who are grieving. And that was never the intention of the research. So I would encourage you to not apply the 5 stages of grief to your journey, even if some of it feels a bit familiar, because it's kind of limiting. And it suggests that there's kind of this linear process of grief when there actually isn't. The thing is that we grieve for the rest of our lives. The grieving that we go through is for the rest of our lives because it is a reflection of our love for somebody. So there isn't an end point. It will, go up and down, and the intensity will shift. And it's much more helpful to see grief, it kind of like the ocean. I use that metaphor of the ocean quite a bit when it comes to grief. It rises at times, it settles in others. There are storms that make you feel like you won't survive and you can't breathe. And then there's moments of calmness that are just beautiful. All of these parts make an ocean, a formidable beauty. And that beauty means it has to have all the mixed states that it has. And grief is very similar. It does have different states and it does move along, and trust that you will not be stuck in one place forever. And now, how do I know that to be true? I know that to be true because as humans, we're created to grieve. It sounds really silly, but hear me out. We are built for connection and love. It's in our DNA. And we need to connect, and we need to love, to survive, and to thrive on this planet. We don't thrive without connection, belonging, and love. We know this from research for thousands of years. We've known this. We need connection, belonging, and love just as much, if not more, than we need water and air. We need it for survival. So it's very intertwined. In that same vein, we're also built for grief and loss. And why is that? Because love and grief are 2 sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. So grief is a reflection of our love for another person. And we only grieve what and who we love. So grief is a representation of that love. Grief is so devastating because our love is really complex and really deep. And so if love and grief are connected and we're built for love, it means that we're actually built for grief. And we know how to do that. Our mind, body, and soul knows how to do this. So trusting that messy process, trusting that it's all over the place sometimes and it rises and it falls and it's not linear, because connection and love and belonging are not linear. They're also all over the place. Messy. Love is messy. Belonging can be messy. Having connection can be messy. So therefore, grief is also going to be messy. How can we navigate this grief? We need to just get out of the way and allow ourselves to just go through it, to feel it. Your every part of your being, everything that makes you who you are, knows how to do this. And you need to trust that. Trust that you know how to get through this because it's in your DNA. Okay, so just like we don't need to teach people how to love per se, you know how to grieve. We don't necessarily need to teach you how to grieve. We also teach you to move out of the way a little bit so you can actually go through that process on your own, in your own way. So you have to trust yourself and get out of the way. You don't have to control it. You don't have to package it. You don't need to avoid it. You just need to let it do what it's going to do and trust that it's going to do what it needs to do. And part of that is being really gentle with yourself, giving yourself permission to not be okay. It's okay not to be okay. And you don't have to know how long this is going to last. You don't have to compartmentalize it, put a timeline on it. It's just about making space to be gentle and compassionate and loving towards yourself. Part of this is like looking at what's on your plate and looking at all the commitments you have and the demands you have on your time and making some adjustments. Maybe you have to reduce your workload or reduce some commitments that you have had on the go, or projects that you're involved in, or, all these other things that we kind of put our time and energy into can be renegotiated because anything that feels like it's too much, you can put off for another date. I know we are so attached to things being very rigid and it has to happen a certain way. And I've made this commitment and I need to be productive. And, everything about our human existence is, timelines and our calendar. It's okay to put all that stuff off. Ask for some understanding and make those changes. In grief, most people don't regret the grieving process. They regret not making time for it. So I want you to start thinking about renegotiating your commitments and asking yourself about your energy levels. Don't try to push through for the sake of pushing through something. Trust me, it doesn't work. You just run yourself into the ground. Grief takes up a lot of energy, and it should. If you really think about it, it should take up a lot of energy. And we don't have to maintain the same level of commitments or things on our to-do list. We can make more space for ourselves and also be more gracious to ourselves. Treat yourself with some kindness, reducing the pressure. When I was at the beginning of my grief journey, I didn't work for months. And when I returned to work, I only went really part-time and slowly built myself up to going back to full-time, which took at least, I think, 10 months. I took a lot of things off my plate. I let go of a lot of commitments and just that I don't have the energy. I don't have the time. And if people understood, great. And that's what I would hope for the understanding. And if they didn't understand, that was okay too, because it's okay for you to take care of yourself. So whatever you can do to be kind to yourself, do that. It's not forever. We often think, well, I can't give this up forever. Well, it's not really forever. It's just for right now. It's for however you need it to. And if this is really hard, because it's often really hard to treat ourselves with kindness, treat yourself like you treat your best friend. Ask yourself, would I say this to my best friend? Would I expect this from my best friend who is going through the same thing? And if the answer is no, then you need to change how you're treating yourself. And you need to make some adjustments to be kind to yourself and to be gentle with yourself. Because you deserve that. And in fact, it's probably really, really necessary to navigate grief in this way, to come out the other side, because this helps us not avoid it or package it up for a later time. It's in the moment, and we need to kind of go through it in that moment. And on that note, we need to think about boundaries. So saying no to anything that doesn't feel right. People have so many expectations of what grieving should be or shouldn't look like. Those are external expectations of what people say. And sometimes people say some pretty hurtful things, even though they're meaning to be helpful or they're meaning to be supportive, but they can actually be really hurtful at sometimes. And they can put expectations on you. This is what you should be doing, or this is what so-and-so would want you to do. And I think you have to think about, giving yourself permission to say no to any or all of it. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Your journeys is yours alone. You don't need to justify it to anybody, and you can just set those boundaries. The greatest freedom I felt in that, storm of grief was the ability just to say no. The absolutely shedding of people pleasing for the first time in my life in that way, I felt so free to set those boundaries in a way that I've never been able to set before. And I'm really good at setting boundaries. So that's saying something. And I mainly felt this way because I didn't really have the energy to do very much. I was just focused on breathing, getting some food in me, getting out of bed, and making the decision every single day to continue on because it felt that heavy. And so anything outside of that was a big fat no for me. And when I started to feel a little bit better, I took on a little bit more, but I was really conscious of that. And if I felt really exhausted, then I would kind of scale back my commitments and go back to saying no. Give yourself the gift of boundaries. Again, you don't have to keep those boundaries for the rest of your life or forever. It's just for right now. I mean, if you want to keep them forever, then go for it. But know that those boundaries can be temporary. And they serve to keep you safe and to keep you well and to keep your energy storage where it should be. Because if you run yourself into the ground, it's also not very helpful. Trust that when you have a small voice that says, I don't really want to do that, or a voice in the back of the head says, I just want to say no, or I feel instant regret from saying yes, You need to set those boundaries. Listen to that internal voice that tells you that it needs to set limits. You don't need to explain yourself to anyone. It's your job to honor your own needs and care for your own self through this process. It is not your job to take care of everybody else or meet everybody else's expectations. And the final thing I'm going to say, Al, and anyone else who's going through a grief journey, is to make time and space for grief. If you don't make time for it, it will force you to make time for it. So grief is patient and it will wait you out. You can run from it. You can try to hide. You can try to put it in a nice box and put it on a shelf somewhere with a really pretty bow. If you think you can, it's a trick. Trust me. It will show up and haunt you in the future if you don't make time and space for it. The best thing you can do is just make some space for it. I know it sounds super weird to like set a date for grief or make, time in your day for grief. But trust me, when it works, when you're trying to get through things and you feel emotions are bubbling up and it becomes really difficult to hold back tears or the intrusive thoughts or the thinking, that if you set time and space in your day for it, it's kind of like your brain just pins it and waits for that moment. Because you've set aside a moment in time to feel the feelings, to deal with the thoughts, to cry and sob and do all the things that you need to do, because the brain just wants you to do that. It just wants to know there's a bit of a plan. It's the avoidance of something that actually gets us into trouble. What I used to do is I used to make my car the place for grief when I was, had a short commute back and forth to work for 20 minutes every day. And at the end of my day, I would listen to some songs and I would cry and I would sob in my car. And for some reason, my car felt like the safe place where I could do all the messy things. I could like ugly cry and I could let the tears just roll and I could scream if I wanted to and I could sob and I could do all the things without judgment from anybody because I was there by myself. And that felt really freeing and weirdly became my safe place, my safe zone for grieving. And you need to create that for yourself, create that safe place for that. The other thing that you can add to create some time and space for grief is, therapy is a really great place for that, for holding space for grief. And I also went to therapy, and therapy was my place for grief and to help process some really complex and confusing feelings. Even though I had a lot of people in my life that I could talk to and felt supported by, therapy just gave me a different type of support where I didn't have to censor myself or be careful of not triggering my support people. Because I know that when we're in this grief journey together with other people and there's a lot of support there, it's great, but we're also censoring because we don't want to hurt somebody else or we don't want to put our own feelings on somebody else. So we're, censoring what we're saying because we want to protect those that we love. And I want to know, what are some ways that you can make some time and space for grief, and who can you talk to and who are you talking to? Because if you're not talking to someone, you need to start talking to somebody. Again, we're not meant to grieve in isolation. We are humans and we're social and we're meant to be connected. And we grieve in connection. We do not grieve in isolation. That becomes really lonely. And it actually, in fact, grieving in isolation can create other mental health issues because it compounds and it creates a lot more complexity. But grieving in connection makes a difference. And it helps us heal our heart and our brokenheartedness a little bit better when we do it with other people. We don't even need to be in conversation with other people. It's just someone just holds space for the ugliness and the hardness and the messiness of it all. And, holds our hand while our heart just breaks. I want to know where you can create a safe place for grief. And if you don't know, then grab a journal, start writing some of these things out and start figuring out how to make space for it instead of trying to see it as a beginning, middle, and end, and just take it one day at a time, one moment at a time, and make space for it. Al, I don't think there's one single right way to prepare for the death of a parent or the death of anyone in our lives, anyone that is meaningful to us. Part of preparing for grief and loss is realizing that we're built for it and that all of us have or will be dealing with death. The strange thing about grief is that it reminds us to live fully. to live bravely and boldly. Our time is really limited, and none of us know how long we're going to be on this planet. And grief puts our life into perspective. And that is perhaps the sliver of a gift of grief, is a reminder that, to live our lives in the way that we want to. And this doesn't mean about, accomplishing goals and, being part of the hustle culture. It's just, looking at your life. And grief is weird. It can either, make you want to wall up, put those walls up and protect yourself from any kind of further pain or hurt from other relationships or other connections, or it breaks you open and it shows you all your gushy parts and all that vulnerability, and it can inspire you to be softer in the world. And I want this conversation to inspire you to be softer in the world, to make the choice to not wall up, to avoid that pain, but to see that pain as a reflection of the love that you have for somebody, and that person is meaningful to you. And you will grieve that person for the rest of your life. And that's just the way it's meant to be, because you don't stop loving someone after they die. We love them forever. So therefore, we won't stop grieving them until the day we die. We can't escape the pain and the heartbreak and the hurt and the lifelong grief that will pop up throughout our lives. But we can choose how it will change us, because death changes us. And in a weird way, it should change us. It should make us realize that life is really limited, and we deserve to live this messy, crazy life as full as possible, with all the ups and downs and with all the joys and heartbreaks that come with it. We deserve that. And sometimes we lose track of that. And grief has a way of stopping us from all the hustle and stopping us from all the distractions that we have around us. And it reminds us about life. And it reminds us that we are here to live life. We're not here to accumulate things and toys and all the things, right? We are here to make connection. And that's what the important thing is to lean into how can grief change us, and making the choice, because it is a choice, that we lean into living life, and that it changes our perspective on life a little bit. I really want to thank you, Al, for your question, because I think this is a difficult topic, and it's one that most of us really like to avoid. And it's actually really necessary, and it's really, really meaningful. I hope you found this episode a little bit helpful in your journey with grief. And if you know someone who's grieving or is anticipating the loss of someone, please share this episode with them. Grief is softer when we can share it with others. And it's just a little bit less sharp when we share it with others, because none of us grieve alone. Like, we're all in this messy human experience or experiment together. And it's much easier and softer if we can do that in connection with others. Thank you for being part of this meaningful conversation today. If you've enjoyed the show, don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and follow button on your preferred platform. Your support fuels the growth of this podcast and enables us to reach more people. This show wouldn't be possible without you. And, it's these questions that people submit that make the most difference. So please submit a question. You can find the link in our show notes for a way to submit your question that is super easy, and for a chance to be featured on our upcoming episodes. Thanks again for being part of the Mental Makeover community. Until next time, be bold, be brave, be well.